Laura, thank you. I can't believe we've known each other for as long as we have, and damn, we look good still. As do all of you, now that I'm seeing all of you face to face. You know, I want to reiterate something that Martha and Simon said about the nature of this conference, the unique nature of this year's conference. We are always on script, and no more so than when we're on a stage presenting to an audience. I want to show you my script for today. I can't even read it, okay? I meant to write points on a note card on the way up with Jed Lippard, but we chatted far too much, and my best attempt to like scrawl something out over the past 30 minutes failed miserably. So the truth is that I have no script to work from, which is great because I really want this to be the kind of conversation that we're hoping to elicit over the next 3 days. The other big goal, which may not have come out as much as I will bring it out right now, is honesty. Personally, I would love for most of you to walk away by Friday morning being able to legitimately say to yourselves, at this conference, I had the most honest conversations about some of the most divisive issues that as heads of school we're facing today. And yes, that does include issues like diversity and pluralism. You don't get to be an author of a book called The Trouble with Islam Today and stand in front of audiences pleading with people to understand that you really are a faithful Muslim and not learn how to be brutally honest and vulnerable at the same time. And with that in mind, to maybe lead the way in the honesty department, I want to begin in what might be a bit of an uncomfortable way. Uncomfortable because both to you and to the live stream audience, hello everybody out there, I'm going to tell you something that is deeply personal, and it's happening as we speak. I'm in the midst of a divorce. My wife and I were married for only 3 years. Didn't work out. I'm ashamed. I'm embarrassed. I'm sad. But I say all of this to you because the message that I've got today about how to depolarize ourselves so that we can role model unity without uniformity in our own schools, that message doesn't work in every circumstance. They say it takes two to tango. I've learned that it also takes two to disentangle. I want to own the limits of what I'm saying to you this afternoon. And in that sense, I want you to know that I feel the permission to be thoroughly vulnerable with each and every one of you, and I hope that you will grab that precedent and allow yourselves to be all that you are at the conference this year. One thing I know about relationships is that they don't have a hope in hell of succeeding if you walk away too soon. Sometimes you do have to walk away. But if you walk away prematurely, you don't know what possibilities you've left on the table. And to stay in the conversation does require moral courage. Andrew, can we put up the next slide, please? Now, there are all kinds of deep definitions of moral courage, but I'm going to keep it simple without being simplistic. Moral courage quite simply means doing the right thing in the face of your fears. Social science research repeatedly affirms that the thing we human beings fear more than anything else, it's not violence, it's being judged. And by implication, being judged negatively. So that when you're involved in trying to solve a problem, over my dead body, the ego says, will I be the loser in this interaction? And so we walk, thinking that's the only way to preserve our dignity. You and I and all of our students are living in a time of outrage. And it is at this time when we're also facing existential challenges, whether it's climate change and mass migration, more often than not, the two being interlinked, whether it is automation and AI. Begs the question, should we really be focusing on STEM if there really aren't going to be all that many jobs available in those fields once automation and AI really begin to gain traction? It's an interesting question. Whether it is the rise of populisms, right and left. These are existential threats. And yes, we are teaching a generation, maybe too late for us, but we are teaching a generation that will need to solve these dilemmas. So of course it's important to stand for the right thing. But that's not all there is to moral courage, it turns out. Because if I stand for the right thing, while demeaning, berating, humiliating somebody whom I believe stands for the wrong thing, then make no mistake, whatever solutions I have to offer won't last. They will not be sustainable. They will not be durable. They will be imposed. And imposition plants the seeds of backlash. So important to remember, if you ask me, when it comes to issues of diversity. That if I stand up here as a person of color and say, let's have a conversation, but what I really mean is, let's have a monologue. I will tell you what's wrong with you and my society, and you will agree because you fear being called a label if you don't agree, and we will walk away and everybody will know what the right thing is. Sure, we can do that. It's been done. But I'm under no illusion that that means that hearts have changed. Least of all, mine. So when I talk about diversity and preparing our students for it and preparing ourselves for it, I don't mean simply diversity of demographics. I also mean diversity of viewpoint. That's the kind of diversity, what I call honest diversity. It includes diversity of demographics, but it also includes diversity of viewpoint. That's the kind of generous, capacious diversity that I call honest diversity. And that is really tough to achieve in an age of outrage. So let's just begin with ourselves first. That if we're going to have schools that are truly crucibles of learning, it seems reasonable to assume that we're going to have the integrity to role model that learning. And that means depolarizing ourselves. I speak very personally when I talk about this process. Let me tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. Laura alluded to it in her lovely introduction. I'm a Muslim, among many other things, but not one who has gone with the flow very often. My family and I are refugees from East Africa, Uganda specifically. We came to North America in 1972. I was 4 years old. And I grew up on the West Coast, Vancouver, British Columbia. And that's where I also attended two kinds of schools. The secular public school of most North American children. And then on top of that, every Saturday for several hours at a stretch, the Islamic religious school known as the madrasa, or if you want to anglicize it, the madrasa. And I took cues from my public school, applied them to my religious school, and asked a lot of questions. Turns out they were highly inconvenient questions. And at the age of 14, I was booted out of my religious school for asking one too many inconvenient question. And I remember, no word of a lie, when I was told to leave for good, I remember thinking, there is a God. I'm not proud to admit it, but I do remember thinking that. That's how desperate I was to express myself freely without losing my faith. It's what happened next that was really instructive. So I decided to walk home after being booted out because I have to think about what I'm going to tell my mother. Not surprisingly, my mother has already received the call when I get home. And I say, Ma, I just need you to understand one thing. Simply because I've left the madrasa does not mean I have left Allah. Just because I'm no longer in the building doesn't mean I've abandoned God. It sounded so good. Not to her. But my mom, working class, Mom, forgive me for saying this, not at all formally educated, she was smart enough to know a little bit about human psychology. She knew that if she tried to force me to ask for forgiveness, not only would I never ask for forgiveness, I might just abandon what was worth keeping in the first place. So she said to me, look, I am not like you. I don't know much about religion. I don't ask the kinds of questions you do. I know what I believe, and I know that you don't always believe it, and that's okay, she said. But I ask just one thing of you. Now that you will not be at the madrasa every Saturday, 8 hours a day, you have all of this time to do with as you please. Think about how you are going to use this time. Yeah, wow, exactly. That's what I felt too. Wow. And because she showed the faith in me to think for myself, which is some kind of respect I never got at the Islamic school, I felt that much more responsibility to live up to her faith in me. Now, let's be honest, most of us in this room, not all I know, but most of us are at that age where we remember the pre-Google days, okay? As am I. And because of that show of faith in my ability to think, instead of going to what was called back then the arcade or the roller rink, I did something profoundly pre-Google every Saturday. I went to the public library and I read everything I could get my hands on about religions, not just my own, cultures, belief systems, big ideas. And it's at that public library and in this time of self-study that I discovered something I would have never learned in my religious school. Something positive, it turns out, about my faith. I learned that Islam has its own tradition of independent thinking and creative reasoning and debate and dissent and, yes, reinterpretation. That kept me in the game. I suddenly realized that I did not have to balkanize myself. I didn't have to choose between being faithful and thoughtful. I could integrate the two. I could have integrity, wholeness. And that kept me going for many years. And then 9/11 happened. I'll simply say this. I realized that my discovery, my personal discovery of this tradition of independent thinking, while it allowed me to have peace, it did not give me the answers that I was seeking for the questions that now the world was asking. And that's when I decided I needed to write the book. That for all the wrong reasons, the world was suddenly interested in. So I wrote The Trouble with Islam Today, a Muslim's call for reform in her faith. But now let me fast forward to tell you something about courage. I stand by this. I felt it at the time, and I will tell you today, it took no courage for me to write that book. People would say to me, oh, you've got so much courage. No, I would tell them. No, I needed to do it. It was begging to be expressed. I'll tell you what courage it did take. What turned out to be a 10-year global conversation, I traveled the world back and forth with the book. Young people, young at the time, to this day still, but even younger at the time, would attend my lectures, my community events and so forth, and they would come up afterwards, those who weren't heckling, and many did. But the ones who weren't heckling would come up to me afterwards to say, thank you for doing what you're doing. Thank you. But in the US South, young Christians would say to me, you want to talk about dogma? Let me tell you about the dogma that's rising in my community. Young Jews would say, Irshad, I hear you on the intolerance. You know, I don't take the same position as my parents about Israel-Palestine. And let me tell you how I'm treated when I express my point of view. I would even hear from atheists, self-described atheists. This was before the Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens really, sort of filled the space. And they would say to me, here's what's weird, Irshad. You're talking about indoctrination. We atheists talk a big game about rationality. And yet, I've noticed that there's a hate-on for people like you in my community, people of faith. Well, hate is irrational. So how do I reconcile that with rationality? In other words, you're not the only one who experiences dogma in your community. Now, you'd think I'd be comforted. You'd think I'd know, I'm not alone. This is helpful. It's not how my ego responded. Feeling perpetually embattled and defensive. My ears, meaning my ego, heard these young people say to me, so it's not really the trouble with Islam. You're wrong. You're mistaken. Your scholarship sucks. Your book has no worth, and therefore you have no worth. Can you believe it? That's what my ego heard. And so every time somebody would say to me, it's not just you and it's not just Muslims, I would get into a debate with them. I would turn what was a conversation into a debate. And I would say, well, what about this and what about that and what about that? And to their credit, probably because they weren't expecting this or needing it to be a debate, most of these kids said to me something along the lines of, interesting points. Thank you, I'll think about that. Now, what do you think about what's happening in my community? And here's what I realized. There was no need to feel threatened. This was not a competition. This was an exploration. And when they gave me the permission to lower my defenses because they already had low defenses, that's when I came to appreciate the larger message here, that we as human beings constantly get in trouble with our interpretations of even great ideas. And that rather than simply decide that there is only one way to do something, we've got to learn how to challenge ourselves in order to have the kind of diversity of thought, of viewpoint, of expression, of being that Irshad Manji is talking about wanting in Islam. They turned the tables on me and showed that my defensiveness was part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that's why I came to appreciate that moral courage means more than just speak truth to power. Sure, I can speak truth to power. Your students can speak truth to power. You're the power in the room. But what they need to understand, as I needed to understand, is that they're not powerless. They may have less power, but that is not the same thing as being powerless. And anybody who has a brain, and I mean that in the biological sense, not as an observation about where someone stands. Anybody who is born with a brain is born with an ego, because ego is a function of the primitive part of the brain. It's our best friend when we're in a life and death situation. It's the ego that will preserve us. It's the ego that'll say, you better fight or you gotta flee. The problem is that most situations that you and I and your students and my students find ourselves in are not situations of mortal danger. They are situations of mere discomfort. And the primitive part of the brain cannot distinguish between mortal danger and mere discomfort. And so if we're reacting defensively, then we're feeding the fear that leads to the us against them paradigm. I talked just moments ago about young people. Let me show you, and Andrew, I'm going to have you play the video in just a second. Let me show you what can happen when a young person learns that listening and engaging can be a far bigger motivator than humiliating. You're about to see a 4-minute video. My project, the Moral Courage Project, threw its cameras on 2 people. One is a young woman named Genesis, the other a young man named Lewis. Now, Genesis and Lewis were born and grew up in Biloxi, Mississippi. Genesis is a former student of mine. That's how I know her. She's also a hip-hop artist. And she very passionately advocates for a change in the design of the Mississippi state flag. Some of you might know that this is a flag that still contains slavery-era symbolism. Well, Genesis feels very personal about all of this. Her grandfather was killed by the KKK as he was trying to protect voters who were black voters who were trying to cast their ballots for the first time. So history is not distant for her. It's deeply intimate. Then there's Lewis. Lewis did not advocate a change in the Mississippi state flag. And by the way, history is intimate for him too. He belongs to an organization called the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He is descended of a soldier fighting for the South in the Civil War. As you will see, Genesis, in her role as a hip-hop artist, one evening protested Confederate Heritage Month, and she did so in a very incendiary way. The response was overwhelming, but instead of shutting down or digging in her heels, she did something quite unexpected. And I want to show you not just what she did, but also the results of it. And with that, Andrew, let's roll.
One day, when I look at the Mississippi state flag, I want to feel welcome and that my history and my heritage is just as valid as everyone else's. I'd like to see a flag that unites us rather than divides us. The crowd had no idea what I was going to do. The promoters of the club had no idea what I was going to do.
Mississippi just named April Confederate Heritage Month. They have the audacity to name April Confederate Heritage Month. I'm gonna show you how I celebrate that shit.
Speaking out on this issue wasn't an easy decision because I know the type of backlash that I would receive. The picture went viral. Engaging online and comments and messages, that's cool, you know, but there's nothing like looking somebody in the eyes and seeing the subtle nuances for them to be able to relate to you and for you to relate to them.
The Confederate battle flag, and I had family members who fought for the Confederacy. It was designed as a flag to differentiate troops on the battlefield.
So when you see the state flag, Mississippi state flag, how does it make you feel?
It's definitely a symbol of, home. What about you?
Makes me feel unwelcome. With my grandfather and my family being harassed by KKK and white supremacists flying and waving that flag, there's a negative connotation when I think of that, and it's not something that I say represents me as a descendant of African Americans.
I see where people are offended by it, but I believe that we should just leave it be because it is history. It does show where we come from. We just need to educate the people as to what that flag is, what it really stands for.
To disrespect your ancestors is not my intent.
No.
At all.
And
Just
know
like
that.
I know you don't want to disrespect
that.
mine. But at the same time, I don't apologize for my protest because I do understand
voices
that.
need to be heard.
Yeah, I do understand that many Confederate descendants do harbor that ideology of white supremacy and don't acknowledge the faults that came with the history. You know, Confederate veterans were the ones who birthed the KKK. What was your reaction when I did my protest?
At first I was kind of upset, and then I start to think about it from your point of view, and that flag has brought me no harm, no hatred towards me. You know, as much as I would like to have it remain, who's to say that my wishes should outweigh the wishes of another? Will I lose my heritage if that flag's changed? No, it won't. We always talk about, you know, if something bothers you, do something about it. Not a lot of people do, and here you are. So I went from upset to understanding to respect. And I support your decision in wanting to change the flag.
To hear Lewis say that he believes in me even though he disagrees with some of the things that I say, that's beautiful. When there's absolutely no trust, it's very hard to have conversations that don't get heated or get violent or abusive and abrasive. If you're unwilling to even listen to someone's point of view or try to empathize of when they're coming from, you're not really adding anything to the table. My name is Genesis B, and I am Moral Courage.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm always struck, by the way, by two things in that video. One is Genesis saying, to hear Lewis say that he believes in me, even though he disagrees with some of the things I say, it reminds me of exactly how my mom approached my expulsion. You know, she believes in me, even though she disagrees with some of the things I say. And that is what allowed me to stick with the overall outcome that my mom was hoping for me, to remain a faithful Muslim, even if it's a highly questioning one. The second thing is, and I speak for myself, as I always do anyway, but let me reiterate here and now, I speak only for myself when I say, you know, I look at Lewis, dusty ball cap, red beard, sweaty shirt. It would be easy to dismiss him as the proverbial redneck. But apart from everything else that he said up there, he said something really profound. Something that most people who work in the realm of diversity and identity and so forth often don't understand, which is, if that flag is changed, will I lose my heritage? No. I still have my heritage. In other words, he wouldn't have this language, you do. Identity does not need to be a zero-sum game. Somebody doesn't have to lose in order for me to win. I get to keep who I am, and I get to accommodate. These are not the kinds of conversations that the media, in all of its manifestations, will air. They're not sensational. They're not loud. They're not ugly. They don't get the clicks. They're not emblematic of the age of outrage. And lest I fall into the trap of pointing my finger at one group of people, namely the media, let me own the fact that we as educators have something to do with this as well. I've done a lot of work with the Mahatma Gandhi Institute for Education for Peace. It's based in New Delhi. And it's through them that I came across a paper widely circulated, and I would go as far as to say in some ways promoted by the Mahatma Gandhi Institute, a paper about the future of education, written under the auspices of UNESCO. And this paper speaks of the purpose of education, and as I quote, I quote, "The purpose of education is to produce someone who understands how the world works, upholds a universal set of rights, enacts responsibilities that contribute to the world community," all good as far as I'm concerned so far, "even at a local scale, and is outraged by social injustices." Folks, I'm not asking anybody here to be unconcerned about social injustice, not at all. I am saying, however, that approaching any challenge through the prism of outrage is to set up an us against them paradigm right away. And this is why, perhaps to the consternation of some of you, I am so far, subject to your pushback, convinced that one of the things we need to be teaching students today is how not to be offended so easily. Offense, for one thing, is the price of diversity, not an impediment to it. Different people naturally have different points of view. In my Islamic Reform chapter of life, I could tell you there were lots of people who were, yes, outraged by my call for reform within the faith, and there were many others, less vocal, because they were more fearful for their reputations, who were nonetheless delighted by it, by the call for reform. They're slowly finding their voices. But what that should remind us is that even within groups, right, there is individuality. And that none of us stops being an individual simply by affiliating with this or that group. Another reason to remind our students, and to indeed teach them not to be offended so easily, is what you already know, that we grow from engaging with those who disagree with us. I recall, the best, and I do mean this in a formal sense, debate I ever had at Oxford University with a highly articulate critic of mine. It turned out to be the best conversation I ever had, because I prepared myself to acknowledge that when he made a really good point, I was going to say so. And I did. When I didn't have the answer for something, I was going to admit, I don't know. And I did. Meaning, I took, I said, I don't know. When I needed time, because I was still processing the information instead of merely reacting, because God forbid I should look weak by not diving right on in. I took a breath. I slowed the blood rush in my body. And all of that made for a discussion unlike any other I had ever had. It was a televised debate. It was literally called Head to Head. And it was the one time in 10 years that I decided not to play the game, the us against them game. And to this day, people write to me to say, I want to have these kinds of conversations. The final reason, before I get to the final reason, it occurs to me to say, I want to have these kinds of conversations, people tell me, because, Irshad, in not wanting to win, you were able to get your interlocutor on side. Now, that wasn't my purpose. I just didn't want to keep playing the same bloody game. It was boring, it was tired, and I was tired. But it turns out that because I listened, I was able to glean his values and reframe my arguments in a way that finally had a shot at being heard, and not just by him, but by the audience. Turns out listening made me a hell of a better communicator. A great skill when raising kids who have the potential to lead in a really messed up world. And the third reason I think it's so important to teach our kids how not to be offended so easily is that, quite simply, it's a life skill. No matter the situation they'll find themselves in the future, or even now. I'm thinking, of course, at home with parents. Learning to say, you know, I think I'm missing something about where you're coming from. Let me try to understand what I'm missing. Help me understand what I'm missing. Is something we don't expect to hear in an age of outrage. And yet that vulnerability lowers defenses at home, at work, in the wider world, as Genesis showed all of us. I want to just say, I know I've said it before, I'm going to say it just one more time. I am not suggesting that in the midst of hate, you and I clam up and conform. No, I'm not suggesting that in the least. I'm saying how we deal with what is happening in front of us is at least as important as dealing with it, period. This is something the kids really love to hear. I'll share it with you. Bruce Lee, the martial arts master, yes, but also it turns out an amazing philosopher. He taught his own martial arts students, be like water. And what he meant by that was, water always gets to where it needs to go, even in the midst of rocks. Because it doesn't label the rocks the oppressor, and it doesn't wish them away. Water washes over them, glides around them, seeps through them. Over time, eroding them, but not discernibly. Nonetheless, water gets to where it needs to be. And that was his point. Whatever the challenge, when you approach it with grace, you wind up being a lot more effective than if you approach it with your defenses up. These and other tips from Bruce Lee, yes, but from many more, are in the book that I've released most recently, Don't Label Me. And you all are going to get a copy of that book before you leave this room today. But I want to warn you about something as I wrap up. I try to live up to my values. I try to not do things the same way over and over again, because I want to keep learning from the people who give me the gift of their time, including teachers and students. And one of the things that teachers and students have said to me repeatedly over the years is that these ideas, pluralism, diversity, inclusion, they're deep. They need to be addressed with nuance, and yet the world doesn't have time for nuance. What the world does have time for, folks, is a story. We human beings, we thrive on story. It's how we learn. It's how we make sense of otherwise really complicated ideas. And so I've written Don't Label Me tips and all, as a story, but specifically as a conversation between me and the creature that used to be my other, a dog. My dog, Lily. One of the things I will always be grateful for to my ex is that she is an animal rights advocate. And boy, does she love her dogs. Having grown up Muslim in a particular culture, I actually came of age with a very unhealthy fear of dogs. I was told that not only are they physically toxic, but they are spiritual pollutants as well, and so you need to stay away from them. And for the longest time, well into my adulthood, I was afraid of dogs. A few years ago, I had a severe health crisis. And the person who would become my wife said to me, Irshad, you need to understand the healing power of having a dog. She said, for God's sake, evolve. And so I did. And I adopted Lily. And I'll confess to you, I adopted her because I thought she was the meekest thing I could cuddle with. After all, she was old and she was blind. Wow, did those labels ever not capture Lily? She was the feistiest, sassiest creature I have ever had the pleasure of rolling in the grass with. And I tell some of those stories in the book, but here's the point. Not only did those labels that I assigned to her not capture her, they in fact distorted who she really was, and in the process of getting to know Lily, I learned so much about diversity. I could literally hear Lily saying some of the things, in fact, everything that I have her say in the book to me, I could hear spill out of her mouth. She is, for lack of a better label, the progressive voice in the book who pushes back against mine. And she puts me in my place, and she makes me think, and she compels me to acknowledge, I don't know the answer to that, but I'd love to hear more from you. And so this book is written with my other, whom I have come to love. And it's written in a way that I hope will role model the kind of conversation that I'm asking you to consider having with your others. And in the process, here's the final bit. In the process, my contention is that in role modeling this kind of honest diversity, diversity of viewpoint, and not just diversity of demographics, you will attract different demographics because you will want different viewpoints, but you will also not shut out those who don't fit a particular demographic, because guess what? They've got, as individuals, their own viewpoints too. And in role modeling this kind of diversity, honest diversity, you're going to be showing your team, your faculty, your students, that it is possible to have a world in which we are all seen as plurals. That's how we can tribe out together. That's the kind of pluralism that allows for unity without uniformity. And it'll take speaking truth to the power of our own egos in order to get there, otherwise known as moral courage. I thank you for your ears. please challenge me. Thank you.